When you look at a lush green valley surrounded by towering cliffs, it might seem like the perfect place for adventure or exploration, but hidden in Natchez, Mississippi, there is a place with a far darker history, a natural hollow that became known as the Devil's Punchbowl. After the Civil War, this secluded area was used as a camp for thousands of newly freed black people. People who had just stepped out of the chains of slavery, hoping to build new lives in a world that promised freedom but often failed to deliver it. The Devil's Punchbowl was both isolated and deceptively beautiful, its cliffs forming a natural barrier that trapped its inhabitants inside. Conditions were harsh, resources were scarce, and disease spread quickly. Families who had survived the unimaginable horrors of slavery suddenly faced new threats. Hunger, sickness, and the struggle to survive in a place meant to provide refuge, but instead became a site of suffering. Yet, the story of the Devil's Punchbowl is more than tragedy. It is a reminder of the resilience of those who sought freedom against impossible odds, of communities striving to protect their families, find work, and reclaim dignity in a world that often refused them both. Today, the Devil's Punchbowl stands as a silent witness to this forgotten chapter of American history. It challenges us to remember, to ask questions, and to acknowledge the full truth of our past, so that the struggles and lives of those who came before us are not erased. If you want to uncover more hidden stories from history and learn truths that are often overlooked, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join us on this journey of discovery. Every story matters, and every truth deserves to be told. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation officially declared freedom for enslaved people, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery across the United States, the promise of liberty remained fragile and incomplete for Black Americans, especially in the South. The transition from slavery to freedom was not a clear line but a treacherous path filled with hidden obstacles. Legal manipulations and social hostility. Black codes, established by Southern state governments, created a system that restricted newly gained rights in subtle and overt ways, ensuring that freedom did not translate into equality or safety. People who were once considered property suddenly had the right to own land or marry, yet they were barred from testifying against white individuals in court, serving on juries, or joining local militias, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Economic independence, the cornerstone of true freedom, was nearly impossible to achieve. Many freed individuals had no resources, no access to fair wages, and no education, forcing them into sharecropping arrangements with former masters. These contracts were deceptively structured, often requiring a significant portion of crops as rent, effectively keeping families trapped in cycles of debt and dependence. Even those who briefly acquired land after the war saw it reclaimed by federal troops who returned it to white landowners, reinforcing the message that the social and economic structures were designed to limit black autonomy. Amid this legal and economic suppression, the social climate was equally threatening. White communities, unprepared and unwilling to accept the sudden upheaval of a racial hierarchy that slavery had long enforced, resorted to intimidation and violence. Minor disputes, whether over the simplest gestures of respect or disagreements over labor agreements, could escalate into life-threatening confrontations. Organized groups like the Ku Klux Klan capitalized on the instability, systematically terrorizing black communities to maintain control and instill fear, ensuring that even newly liberated individuals could not freely navigate their own towns or defend their interests. In the midst of this precarious reality, many black families sought refuge in cities like Natchez, Mississippi, where Union control offered a glimmer of protection and the hope of opportunity. They arrived with the dream of building lives removed from the whip of their former masters. Yet the infrastructure to support them was insufficient, and the camps established to provide shelter and work quickly became overcrowded and unsanitary. Freed people faced the compounded dangers of environmental hazards, disease, and the relentless pressures of social prejudice. Survival required ingenuity, resourcefulness, and an unwavering determination to protect loved ones and retain dignity in circumstances that continually threaten both. This period illuminates the stark contrast between legal freedom and lived reality, revealing that the end of slavery was not an endpoint, but the beginning of a new struggle. Black Americans were legally free yet socially constrained, economically vulnerable, and constantly exposed to violence. Their journey was defined by resilience in the face of a society that had yet to accept them as equals, by the courage to seek opportunity despite systemic barriers, and by the enduring hope that one day the promises of liberty and justice might extend fully to them. The story of this era, intertwined with the experiences at places like Devil's Punchbowl, underscores the harsh truth that emancipation was only the first step in a long and painful path toward genuine freedom and recognition, one that required both courage and endurance to navigate. For many newly freed black families, the promise of freedom quickly collided with the harsh realities of an economy still dominated by those who had once enslaved them, and the path to self-sufficiency was riddled with obstacles designed to maintain control. After generations of forced labor and denied education, many of these individuals had neither savings nor tools to establish independent livelihoods, leaving them with little choice but to enter into labor agreements with white landowners, often the very people who had held them in bondage. These contracts, deceptively framed as voluntary, were exploitative by design. They required the workers to give a significant portion of their crops as payment, with harsh penalties for those who failed to meet demands. In practice, the system kept families tied to the land and to the whims of their former masters, ensuring that economic freedom remained elusive even in a society that legally recognized their liberation. Those who had managed, through determination or circumstance, to acquire land after the war faced new threats to their autonomy. Federal troops, enforcing policies meant to stabilize the post-war South, sometimes returned lands to former white owners, undermining the fragile gains of black families and reinforcing the message that their rights were conditional, always subject to the priorities of those in power. Even when families managed to hold on to property, they were often isolated, with limited access to markets, supplies, or community networks that could help them sustain their livelihoods. This combination of legal loopholes, social intimidation, and economic pressure made self-sufficiency a daily struggle, and for many, the dream of building generational wealth or creating a stable home remained just out of reach. Amid these challenges, the experiences of freed people in places like Natchez were emblematic of a broader pattern across the South. Families arrived hoping to rebuild their lives and find safety, only to encounter a system that continually sought to constrain them. The arrival of tens of thousands of freed individuals into cities and towns overwhelmed local resources. And while union authorities established refugee camps to provide temporary housing and employment, the facilities were insufficient, poorly managed, and often dangerous. The hollows, fields, and natural enclosures that were meant to shelter them became sites of hardship, where disease, hunger, and exhaustion were constant threats, and where the line between temporary refuge and enforced confinement blurred. Even as women and children labored tirelessly, they were navigating a world that had yet to reconcile with their freedom. The labor contracts that tethered them to land they did not own mirrored the systems of control they had left behind, and the constant threat of losing the little they had acquired reinforced the fragility of their circumstances. These experiences illuminate the reality that emancipation was far more than a legal milestone. It was a protracted struggle against entrenched economic and social structures determined to limit the autonomy of Black Americans. Every day was a negotiation between survival and dignity, and every family's story reflected the tension between hope and systemic oppression. The historical record of this period, intertwined with accounts from refugee camps like Devil's Punchbowl, reveals a society in transition, one in which freedom was legally declared but socially constrained, where the echoes of slavery persisted in contracts, laws, and expectations, and where the resilience of those seeking to reclaim their lives became the defining feature of their struggle in navigating exploitive labor, protecting family, and attempting to maintain ownership of land against overwhelming odds. These freed people demonstrated courage and resourcefulness, carving out spaces of agency in a world that consistently sought to deny it, and laying the foundation for generations that would continue the fight for justice and equality. As news of emancipation spread through the South, word reached countless freed families that certain towns offered a semblance of protection and a chance to rebuild lives shattered by generations of bondage. Natchez, Mississippi, a thriving river port with Union control, emerged as a beacon of hope for thousands seeking safety and opportunity. A place where they might finally taste the freedom promised to them on paper. Families arrived in waves, traveling on foot, by wagon, or in small boats along the river, carrying only what they could, their hopes intertwined with the fear of the unknown. The city, which had once been a relatively small and structured community, suddenly faced a dramatic influx of people whose lives had been shaped by enslavement and displacement, and the sudden surge transformed Natchez almost overnight into a bustling, chaotic hub of human resilience and desperate need. The Union Army, while sympathetic in intent, was unprepared for the sheer scale of this migration. The infrastructure of the city and the existing camps could not accommodate the tens of thousands who arrived, leaving people to find shelter wherever possible, from abandoned buildings to makeshift tents in open fields. Streets that had once been orderly were now alive with the clamor of families searching for food, clean water, and safe spaces for their children. The demographic shift was dramatic. Freed blacks began to outnumber the white population, their presence reshaping the social and economic fabric of the town. For many, Natchez represented a first taste of agency, a chance to navigate a world where their labor could be exchanged for wages rather than claimed as property, where education might be accessible to their children, and where the bonds of family could be nurtured outside the constant threat of sale or separation. Yet, hope existed alongside adversity. Resources were scarce, disease spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions, and tensions simmered between the newcomers and the city's established residents. Even as black families sought to establish gardens, find work, and claim land, they encountered hostility and systemic obstacles. The legal and social frameworks that had constrained them before emancipation did not disappear overnight, and Union authorities struggled to balance the needs of freed people with the remnants of Confederate resistance still present in the surrounding countryside. Camps intended to provide temporary refuge sometimes became semi-permanent settlements, with families trapped by circumstance and necessity rather than choice, facing harsh weather, insufficient food, and the constant uncertainty of survival. Despite these challenges, the migration to Natchez was a testament to the determination and courage of freed individuals and families who refused to be confined by the limits imposed on them by history or circumstance. They brought skills, knowledge, and hope, contributing to the city's growth and slowly reshaping its identity. Children attended makeshift schools, adults sought employment wherever it could be found, and communities formed around shared experience and mutual support. This movement not only highlighted the struggle for survival but also demonstrated the unyielding pursuit of dignity, independence, and the reclamation of humanity that slavery had sought to deny. Natchez became more than a destination. It became a symbol of possibility and a living reminder of the resilience of people who, even in the aftermath of oppression, dared to move forward, to claim space, and to envision a life defined by choice rather than imposed limitations. As the waves of newly freed black families arrived in Natchez, The Union authorities faced a challenge far greater than they had anticipated. The refugee camp, hastily established to provide shelter and basic necessities, quickly became overwhelmed by the sheer number of people seeking safety and a chance to start anew. What was intended as a temporary refuge soon revealed itself as a place of hardship, where the lack of proper planning and resources transformed hope into a daily struggle for survival. Tents and makeshift shelters were crowded together with little regard for hygiene or spacing, and the infrastructure to supply clean water, adequate food, and medical care was insufficient for the growing population. Families who had traveled long distances, exhausted and traumatized by years of enslavement and the uncertainties of the post-war South, found themselves living in conditions that tested every ounce of resilience they had left. Disease spread rapidly through the camps, fueled by overcrowding and poor sanitation. Outbreaks of smallpox, dysentery, and other illnesses claimed lives at a frightening rate, particularly among children and the elderly, who were the most vulnerable. Parents struggled to keep their families alive, rationing whatever food they could obtain, scavenging for clean water, and improvising makeshift bedding from whatever materials were available. The physical labor demanded of able-bodied men, coupled with long waits for supplies and the constant threat of illness, created an environment where exhaustion and desperation became daily companions. Even the most determined families faced heartbreaking losses, as illness and malnutrition claimed lives that had just begun to experience the possibility of freedom. Compounding these difficulties was the lack of coordination and organization within the camps themselves. Union soldiers, sympathetic but stretched thin, attempted to manage the influx, but their efforts often fell short, leaving communities to fend for themselves as best they could. Some individuals and families banded together, pooling resources, sharing knowledge, and caring for the sick, creating fragile networks of support in the midst of chaos. Education, initially envisioned as a key component of the camps, was difficult to implement. Teachers were scarce, and schools were improvised in tents or abandoned buildings. Yet, even under these conditions, the desire for learning and advancement persisted. Children attended classes whenever possible, and adults sought any opportunity to acquire skills that could help them navigate the uncertain future beyond the camp gates. The psychological toll was equally severe. For people who had endured the horrors of slavery, the camps were a paradox. They were simultaneously a place of potential freedom and a stark reminder of the vulnerability that still defined their existence. Every day brought uncertainty whether they would receive enough food, whether the sick would survive, and whether they could ever leave the confines of the camp to reclaim control over their lives. Despite these challenges, the residents of the camps demonstrated remarkable resilience. They adapted to their surroundings, innovated solutions to daily problems, and maintained hope that their circumstances could improve. Their determination to survive, care for one another, and retain a sense of dignity in the face of systemic neglect highlights both the fragility and the strength of freedom during this critical period. In the context of Natchez and the Devil's Punchbowl, the refugee camps illustrate the complex and often harsh reality of emancipation. Legal freedom did not guarantee safety, resources, or equality, and the struggle to navigate overcrowded, poorly managed camps underscored the ongoing obstacles Black Americans faced in building lives for themselves and their families. These camps were not just temporary shelters, they were crucibles in which the resilience, ingenuity, and enduring spirit of a people striving for autonomy were forged, leaving a legacy of courage that would echo through generations. Life inside the camps around Natchez, and particularly in the natural hollow that came to be known as the Devil's Punchbowl, was an unforgiving ordeal where the harshness of the environment compounded the suffering already endured by freed Black families. The sweltering Mississippi heat bore down relentlessly, turning tents and makeshift shelters into stifling ovens, while the dense humidity made every task more exhausting. every movement a test of endurance. Men were put to back-breaking labor from sunrise to sunset. Clearing land, building rudimentary structures, or performing the endless chores required to maintain the overcrowded camp. Their muscles screaming from fatigue and their bodies racked by heatstroke and exhaustion. Women and children, who often remained behind while men worked, were equally vulnerable, struggling to secure scarce food and water while tending to the sick and protecting their families from the dangers of an unforgiving environment. Malnutrition was widespread. Rations were meager, irregular, and inadequate for the demands of the labor required, leaving the camp's residents weak and susceptible to disease. Smallpox, a particularly deadly illness, spread quickly among the cramped living quarters, its symptoms striking fear into anyone who witnessed its effects. Fever, vomiting, painful pustules, and scarring were only the beginning. For many, the disease proved fatal. Water, when available, was often contaminated, a vector for dysentery and other deadly illnesses that further thinned the population. Children, already fragile from years of hardship, were particularly at risk, their immune systems overwhelmed by the combined effects of hunger, dehydration, and relentless labor. Amid these physical dangers, the psychological toll was immense. Families who had finally escaped the brutality of slavery found themselves trapped in conditions that mirrored, in cruelty if not in origin, the oppression they had sought to leave behind. The natural geography of the Devil's Punchbowl, with its steep cliffs and enclosed hollows, created a sense of entrapment, a constant reminder that survival depended on navigating both the human and environmental hazards of the camp. Parents watched helplessly as loved ones fell ill, sometimes succumbing to the elements or disease before they could reach help, while others worked tirelessly in hopes of providing enough sustenance to prevent further loss. The relentless heat and labor became almost a form of silent torment, exacerbating the physical and emotional exhaustion of everyone in the camp. Despite the despair, there were stories of resilience and ingenuity. Families devised ways to stretch rations, improvise shelter, and care for the sick using whatever knowledge and resources they could muster. Some men crafted makeshift tools or protective gear to ease the burden of labor, while women organized communal support systems to share food and monitor the health of the children. These efforts, however, could only partially mitigate the harsh reality. Even the strongest and most resourceful individuals were at the mercy of the climate, disease, and inadequate provisions. Every day brought new challenges, and the toll on bodies and spirits was staggering, leaving a profound mark on those who survived. The extreme conditions of the Devil's Punchbowl camps illustrate the harsh paradox of freedom in the post-Civil War South. While emancipation legally ended slavery, it did not guarantee safety, sustenance, or protection from environmental and societal hazards. The experiences of those confined within these camps reveal a crucial truth. Freedom was not merely a matter of legal status, but a struggle to survive, to maintain dignity, and to navigate a world that often remained hostile despite the promises of liberation. The stories of labor, disease, and endurance in the face of extreme heat, malnutrition, and deprivation stand as testimony to both the cruelty imposed by circumstance and the yielding human spirit that fought to endure it. The tragedy of the Devil's Punchbowl extended far beyond the immediate suffering of its living residents, casting a long shadow over the landscape where thousands struggled to survive. As disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion claimed lives, the dead were often left where they fell, their bodies adding to the grim reality of a camp that had become both a refuge and a site of mass loss. There was no proper cemetery, no ceremony to honor those who had finally escaped the bonds of slavery only to encounter the cruelty of circumstance and neglect. Instead, The corpses were interred in hastily dug pits or left exposed until others, themselves weakened and overwhelmed, were tasked with burying them. Some survivors, armed only with shovels and an instinct for survival, were instructed to cover the bodies exactly where they had succumbed, a process that must have been as psychologically harrowing as it was physically exhausting. The natural contours of the Punchbowl, with its steep cliffs and hollowed valleys, became both a tomb and a monument to the countless lives cut short in a place that was meant to offer protection, but delivered despair. Within this somber hollow, 3 primary mass grave sites were known to exist, though their exact boundaries remain difficult to determine even today. These sites held the remains of men, women, and children who had arrived in search of freedom, only to encounter the compounded hardships of overcrowding, inadequate provisions, and relentless disease. Each grave represented not just an individual life lost, but a story interrupted, a potential never realized, and a family torn apart. Survivors recalled the fear and sorrow of witnessing the accumulation of bodies, the grim routine of burial, and the quiet despair that pervaded every corner of the camp. The mass graves served as a chilling reminder of the human cost of neglect. Environmental hardship, and the inability or unwillingness of the authorities to provide the support necessary for survival. Even in death, the conditions reflected the inequities and indifference that had shaped life in the camp. Families could not mourn openly. There was no space for proper rites, no time to honor loved ones with dignity. Instead, death became an almost anonymous state, each individual a statistic in a growing tally of human suffering. Oral histories from the area speak of occasional floods and heavy rains uncovering skeletal remains, a haunting testament to the countless people who perished, leaving only faint traces of their existence on the land. The very soil of the Devil's Punchbowl, once part of the natural landscape, became inseparable from the memory of those who died there, turning the hollow into a silent witness to tragedy and resilience alike. The mass graves also illustrate a broader truth about the post-Civil War struggle. Legal freedom did not equate to security or protection. The camps were intended as temporary solutions. Yet the lack of planning, oversight, and resources created conditions that rivaled the hardships the freed population had endured under slavery. Disease, starvation, and exposure to the elements transformed what was meant to be a haven into a crucible, and the graves stand as stark evidence of the lethal consequences of systemic neglect. Survivors were left to navigate a world where the promise of liberty clashed with the realities of vulnerability, where life and death were intertwined in the daily struggle for survival, and where the memory of lost loved ones lingered as both a warning and a testament to human endurance. The story of the mass graves at Devil's Punchbowl underscores the brutal complexities of emancipation, revealing a chapter in American history that is both painful and instructive. These graves are not merely historical footnotes but a reflection of resilience and loss, a reminder that the journey from bondage to freedom was neither immediate nor guaranteed, and that the cost of survival in the aftermath of slavery was measured in both courage and human life. The Devil's Punchbowl remains an enduring symbol of how systemic failure, environmental hardship, and social neglect converged to shape the fate of those seeking a new beginning in a world still unprepared to embrace their freedom. While the story of the Devil's Punchbowl has often been described in stark and harrowing terms, historians continue to debate the nature of the camp and the circumstances that led to the suffering of its inhabitants. Some argue that labeling it a concentration camp misrepresents the reality of what occurred, suggesting that the deaths and hardships were less the result of deliberate racial cruelty and more a tragic outcome of disease, mismanagement, and the overwhelming logistics of post-war displacement. The Union Army, though committed to the abolition of slavery and the protection of freed people, was suddenly confronted with a massive influx of refugees, a population far exceeding the capacity of existing shelters. Supplies, and personnel. Their intentions, while imperfectly executed, were aimed at providing some measure of safety and support. Yet the scale of need and the limitations of available resources created conditions in which survival became a daily struggle. The natural geography of the Devil's Punchbowl, with its steep cliffs and enclosed hollows, compounded these difficulties, inadvertently trapping those who sought refuge within its borders. The combination of extreme heat, inadequate shelter, limited access to clean water, and insufficient food created an environment in which disease could spread with devastating speed. Smallpox, dysentery, and other illnesses ravaged the camp, claiming lives at rates that shocked both the residents and the soldiers tasked with overseeing the area. Historians who examine contemporary records suggest that the Army's failure to adequately plan for the massive migration of freed people was the central factor in the tragedy, and that while the suffering was immense, there is little direct evidence to indicate that it was intended as a tool of racial oppression. Nevertheless, the impact on those confined within the camp was profound. Families who had left plantations and towns under threat from Confederate sympathizers arrived with hopes of stability, safety, and the ability to begin new lives, only to encounter overwhelming adversity. Adults struggled to maintain the health and morale of their children while performing grueling labor, and the dead were often buried where they fell, leaving survivors with both the grief of loss and the burden of physically interring their loved ones under harsh conditions. These circumstances fostered a climate of fear, exhaustion, and despair that, regardless of intent, mirrored the dehumanization that many had hoped to escape. In examining the historical record, it becomes clear that the tragedy of the Devil's Punchbowl cannot be reduced to simple categorization. The deaths that occurred were the result of a complex interplay of environmental factors, disease, overcrowding, and inadequate preparation, rather than systematic torture or deliberate racial targeting. Yet, the perception of intentional cruelty has persisted, shaped in part by oral histories, survivor accounts, and the collective memory of communities who experienced similar hardships across the South. These narratives emphasize the precariousness of freedom during this era and the ongoing vulnerability of those recently emancipated, highlighting the gap between legal liberation and practical security in a society struggling to accommodate profound social change. Moreover, the story serves as a reminder of how history is interpreted and transmitted. While some may emphasize the lack of malicious intent on the part of Union forces, the experiences of those who lived through the camps cannot be dismissed, and the human cost remains undeniable. It underscores the reality that even with the best of intentions, poor planning and systemic constraints can have catastrophic consequences, particularly for populations already marginalized and traumatized. The Devil's Punchbowl, then, exists as both a cautionary tale and a site of reflection, revealing the fragile line between liberation and vulnerability, and the ways in which logistical failure, environmental hardship, and social neglect can intertwine to produce suffering that is as profound as it is avoidable. Ultimately, the debate over terminology, whether concentration camp or refugee camp, does not diminish the human tragedy that unfolded there. The suffering, loss, and resilience of the freed people who passed through the Devil's Punchbowl remain central to understanding the complexities of emancipation, illustrating that freedom, while legally guaranteed, often came at a staggering human cost and required the endurance of those whose lives were forever shaped by both hope and hardship. Amid the overwhelming hardships of the Devil's Punchbowl and other refugee camps, stories of survival and resilience emerge that speak to the enduring strength of the human spirit. For those who managed to endure the extreme heat, back-breaking labor, malnutrition, and rampant disease, life offered opportunities to reclaim some measure of autonomy and rebuild connections that slavery had torn apart. Families, separated for years by forced sales, flight, or wartime dislocation, began the painstaking process of reunification, tracking down loved ones through word of mouth, letters, and sheer determination. These reunions, though often bittersweet in the shadow of loss, became vital sources of emotional support, grounding survivors in a network of kinship that helped them endure the ongoing challenges of life after emancipation. Young men and women, who had survived the relentless conditions of the camps, found avenues to assert agency over their own destinies. Many enlisted in the Union Army, joining the fight not only to secure the final defeat of the Confederacy, but also to stake a claim to their citizenship and personal agency. Military service provided structure, protection, and a sense of purpose, while also offering wages, training, and camaraderie that could help transform former suffering into opportunity. Others found work as laborers on plantations or in emerging towns, navigating the delicate balance of earning a livelihood while negotiating a social landscape still shaped by racial prejudice and economic inequality. Despite the legal guarantees of freedom, daily life required ingenuity, caution, and courage to navigate a world that often remained hostile to their presence and aspirations. Education, though limited in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, played a significant role in the rebuilding of lives. Northern teachers and volunteer educators, where available, introduced literacy, numeracy, and basic skills to children and adults alike, fostering a sense of empowerment and possibility. These early educational efforts became a foundation for future generations, allowing families to envision futures beyond the immediate struggle for survival. Small victories, like securing a modest home, cultivating a garden, or sending a child to school, became markers of resilience and triumph, testifying to the determination to claim dignity and stability despite the adversity of the camps and the broader societal challenges that awaited outside their confines. Communities that formed within and around the camps were critical in sustaining this resilience. Mutual aid networks emerged as families and neighbors shared resources, knowledge, and protection, creating informal systems of support that allowed survival to become a collective endeavor. Cultural practices, religious observances, and oral traditions were maintained and adapted, reinforcing identity and continuity even in circumstances designed to strip autonomy and agency. These communal bonds not only helped residents endure immediate hardships, but also laid the groundwork for the social and political organization that would fuel future advocacy for civil rights, equality, and recognition of Black Americans' place in the nation. In the long view, the survival of some freed people after the camps stands as a testament to human endurance and the pursuit of dignity against staggering odds. Their stories of reunion, military service, labor, education, and community building highlight the capacity for resilience in the aftermath of systemic oppression, illustrating that even in the darkest conditions, agency, courage, and determination can carve paths toward a more hopeful future. The Devil's Punchbowl and similar sites were crucibles in which the struggle for survival forged not only hardship, but also strength, adaptability, and vision, leaving a legacy of perseverance that would echo through generations and shape the evolving narrative of freedom in post-Civil War America. The story of the Devil's Punchbowl, like so many experiences of freed Black people in the aftermath of the Civil War, highlights a chapter of American history that has often been overlooked or deliberately omitted from mainstream narratives. While textbooks celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment as milestones of freedom, they rarely delve into the complexities and dangers that newly liberated individuals faced as they attempted to navigate a society still deeply entrenched in racial prejudice and economic inequality. The camps, the mass graves, And the extreme hardships endured by thousands are not just isolated incidents. They are reflective of a broader pattern of systemic neglect and racial oppression, illustrating how the promise of freedom was undermined by logistical failures. Societal resistance and environmental hazards. By examining these stories, we gain a more nuanced understanding of the challenges of emancipation, seeing that freedom was not simply a legal status but a daily struggle for survival, dignity, and the right to belong. Remembering the Devil's Punchbowl and other similar camps is essential because it restores the humanity of those who suffered, giving voice to individuals whose lives were cut tragically short or whose resilience went unrecognized. It reminds us that history is not just about victories or legal proclamations. It is about people, communities, and the human cost of social and political transitions. Each survivor, each story of endurance, represents a refusal to be erased, a testament to the strength and determination that persisted even in the face of overwhelming adversity. These narratives challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past, to acknowledge the ways systemic injustice has shaped society, and to ensure that the lessons learned inform our ongoing pursuit of equity and justice. As we reflect on the Devil's Punchbowl, we are reminded that history is not complete without the voices of those who lived it, that understanding the full story requires courage, curiosity, and a willingness to dig deeper than what is often presented in conventional accounts. By exploring these hidden histories, we honor the lives lost, recognize the resilience of survivors, and confront the legacies of inequality that continue to resonate today. This story, while heartbreaking, also offers hope. It shows that even under the harshest conditions, human strength, community, and the desire for freedom can endure and lay the foundation for future generations. Thank you for watching and taking the time to learn about this important part of our history. By remembering stories like the Devil's Punchbowl, we ensure that the sacrifices, struggles, and resilience of these individuals are never forgotten. If you found this video enlightening, please like and subscribe to our channel so we can continue to uncover and share these powerful, often untold stories. Your support helps bring forgotten histories to light and keeps the conversation about justice, equality, and human dignity alive for everyone.